Hello everyone, Ruby Ravel here, a whirling tornado ready to uproot your neurons from the garden of your mind. Here to talk to you today about Uranus stationing retrograde. I will admit that this transit snuck up on me. For about a few weeks I'd been feeling this jittery, nervous, erratic energy sizzling within me, as though some hidden force in my nervous system was gradually being brought to some kind of point of explosive boiling point, when abruptly on August 29th I suddenly had a bit of a breakdown where I felt like my mind had been hit with an electric hammer, breaking apart the constraints of my skull and filling it with unwanted thunder and lightning. And when I noticed today that Uranus had stationed retrograde, I went, that's why. The question that needs to be asked is, why does the planet Uranus feel the need to announce its presence in our life by suddenly filling us with so much voltage, by fomenting breakdowns, by making us feel overwhelmed and anxious and filled with thoughts and experiences and sensations that are beyond our understanding, by taking the smooth, orderly workings of our lives and suddenly overturning it with the unexpected, with shocks, with surprises, with little spasms of chaos? To me, part of the answer is that there is no real such thing as chaos. Rather, Uranus is an envoy, an ambassador for a higher sense of cosmic order that is yearning for expansion, for evolution, and for growth. And just as in the Darwinian model of evolution, a lot of the apparent changes in species occurs through random bursts of chance mutation, Uranus works in much the same way, in that it realizes there can only be true growth and progress in the universe if previously orderly, neat, confined and constrained things suddenly mutate and veer off path in an unexpected direction. Otherwise, things become a bit too safe, a bit too sane, a bit too clockwork. Everything works round in neat, orderly spirals. And if we want anything to change, if we want anything new to come into the collective human experience, then there has to be a little earthquake that causes the stylus to veer wildly off to the paper and into a whole new dimension. When I think of Uranus and what the Uranian experience can be like personally and individually, it reminds me of a book called Flatlands, which I will admit I have never read, but I know the concept of. But it's based on the experience of this land where everything is two-dimensional. Everything is just two-dimensional shapes, and everyone experiences things in two dimensions, just as squares or as circles or as triangles. And then one day, a shattering, euphoric, terrifying experience occurs to one of these two-dimensional shapes, when suddenly they are plucked out of their narrow two-dimensional reality and into the higher third dimension, where suddenly this whole new plane of existence is revealed and opened up to them. They realize that things don't just have to be squares or circles, but that there can be spheres and pyramids and things with whole other sides that change the directions you move, which would have previously been not just impossible, but even unfathomable, impossible to conceive. And when this two-dimensional being gets taken back to its flatland and tries to tell everyone about this three-dimensional revelation that it's had, then they all think he's insane, because he's talking about something that is basically impossible to comprehend unless you've actually experienced it. So the role that Uranus plays when it touches us individually is to break apart and destroy and shatter an area where we have become too rigid and too certain and too complacent in our approaches. As Uranus stationing retrograde is currently in trine with Mercury, most of this is about challenging the limitations of our mind and the doorways of our perception. Now, the interesting thing about Mercury and Uranus is that they are both considered to be different octaves, different levels of the same energetic experience. Mercury rules the personal, individual mind, the idea that we have this brain, we have a private, mental, intellectual sphere that is all our own. But Uranus, being an outer planet, governs a collective mind. You could say that it's the hive mind of the human race, but also the universe at large. So just imagine that you took all of the different thoughts and ideas of every human being currently on the planet, and you extracted it from their heads, and it all got sucked up to this giant sphere in the sky, so that all of these individual separated thoughts became one giant, overwhelming conglomerate of accumulated psychic and intellectual energy. Then Uranus is that planet and is that experience. But also, because Uranus is so far out on the outskirts of our solar system, I feel he's also acting as an ambassador for thoughts and ideas that are somewhat alien, somewhat esoteric, somewhat beyond the bourne of what we think of as being earthly. They are ideas that are coming from another dimension, another plane, another sphere, that are penetrating to us beyond the limitations of our solar system and our solar thinking, and infecting us with something that instead is challenging us not to just be human and to be content with being earthly beings, but which wants us to transgress and transcend the limitations of what we think it is to be human at all, to push us into higher reaches that would eventually cause us to go beyond this planet and out there or in there into deeper realms of possible experience and interactions and relationships and mental synchronicities with the cosmos at large. And if that all sounds rather abstruse, it's because it is. But when you experience Uranus on a personal level, it suddenly makes more sense than anything else. It shatters the smallness, the pettiness, the myopia of the rather banal thoughts of the personal human mind, and suddenly explodes it so that it is full and receptive and ripe with possibilities and strange fruits that normally we are too consumed by mundane considerations to see are there. So Uranus, when it touches Mercury, can feel like a mind expanding and mind awakening experience. But before we experience some of the euphoria and exhilaration of that, there usually has to be a shock. Because there is a reason that our personal, private minds can be so petty and trivial and mundane. It's because we feel safer there. Because most of the time our minds are oriented either towards thoughts that concern our immediate survival and the collecting and responding to the information and data that is occurring in our immediate environment, or is just based on, keeping us entertained, keeping us intellectually fed so that life feels interesting rather than boring. But because of that, our minds when they are not challenged, when they are not being subjected to regular periods of growth, can very easily get stagnant. Our minds can just go round and round in circles, just thinking the same things that we've always thought, perceiving the same things we've always perceived, and believing the same things we've always believed. And when our mind gets stuck in these grooves, in these stagnant patterns of habituation, then our life ends up mirroring that stagnation. We can only move in this life as far as our thoughts will permit us to move. If our mind goes round in circles, then the rest of our life goes round in circles as well. But when we have that Uranian aha, eureka moment where suddenly we see something that we never saw before, where we are awakened and enlightened and made aware of something that previously was kept in the darkness through that sudden thunderbolt of epiphany, then a whole new area of life becomes possible for us to explore. We have to experience it intellectually before we can begin to think that maybe it's something that could happen out there in the world, especially as Uranus challenges us to innovate, to experiment, to perhaps even make up or think things that have never been thought or made before. If we become aware that a certain thing could potentially, theoretically be possible, but hasn't yet been done, then we are left with the terrible and exciting burden of having to be that trailblazer who says, I could do something with this. You know, if we think about all these breakthroughs that have happened in technology, you know, if we think about the invention of the telephone, the idea that we could speak to someone on the other side of the world in real time, hundreds of years ago would have been considered crazy, at least as a technological idea. Some people would have believed in it as a psychic and spiritual experience. But once you have that Uranian breakthrough that says, actually, I can figure out how this would be practicably possible, then the whole scope of how humans can connect with one another is suddenly blown into a whole new universe. And to think of an individual person being responsible for changing the functioning of the human race at large is a huge and terrifying responsibility. That's why with Uranus we do often feel that we have this sudden flash or an idea that feels like a revelation from the Godhead, from the universe itself, that all those wonderful ideas that are floating around in the infinite mind of God suddenly, for a perhaps brief but exhilarating and terrifying moment, becomes our own thought. We become a vessel for that higher idea, and we then have to figure out how to transmit and express that to the world, which can be very difficult when what we are attempting to transmit or express may be something for which the language and the theory does not yet exist. And therefore we have to reinvent language. We have to reinvent the very concept of how communication works, so that we can find the right vessels for which these amazing, terrifying, sometimes horrific, divine ideas can be communicated. And I emphasized the word terror and horror there several times because that is usually the immediate experience that we first feel when Uranus comes along to challenge our thoughts about the world. If we have very rigid beliefs and views that say, this is possible, that's not possible, these are the things that are worth focusing on, those are the things that are unworthy of our attention, life becomes much more finite and manageable. We have made rules about reality that make it safer and neater for us to interact with. We have drawn fences around the little parts of infinity that we have decided we will have a conceptual, intellectual, ideological relationship with, and dismiss the rest as being beneath us, as being the chaff separated from the mercurial wheat, as something that someone else can deal with, or which we may refuse to believe exists altogether. Life is safer and more manageable when it is finite. We don't have to run the risk of being overwhelmed. But when Uranus comes along and breaks the threshold and shatters the rigid dogmas of our minds, that challenges us to realize that something that we previously thought was ridiculous or impossible or improbable or without worth may actually be profoundly important, then we have to reevaluate how we look at the world, how we think about the world. Our mind is a tool for having a relationship with reality. And a lot of the way that it deals with the complexity of reality is to deliberately have blind spots, to deliberately have bits of information and sensual data that are edited out. And I feel like when Uranus comes along, suddenly all of that, the nasty or weird or strange things that we've edited out to make reality more manageable, for a brief moment we can suddenly see all at once in this terrifying flash of awareness. If we had to live with that awareness all the time, our nervous systems would probably find it too much. We would probably go insane. But in those little brief flashes, we can take time to gradually process and digest what we have seen and experienced and think about, what do I do with this new knowledge? How does that change the way I relate to the world and to humans and sentient beings in general? How does this change my perception of myself? You know, so the reason that Uranus is associated with eccentricity and idiosyncrasy is that when we are seeing things from that cosmic perspective and not just the small, mundane, myopic perspective of just focusing on our day-to-day survival, suddenly all those little things, they feel trivial, they feel insignificant because the lens has been pulled up to incorporate that much more of the cosmos. And our human body, our human vessel, feels less important as well, because we start to feel that our life is not just to be lived just for the sake of survival and hoarding up things that benefit our survival, but that there is a deeper purpose to our life, that we are part of a greater cosmic pattern, that we are part of the mechanism of God exploring himself through the strange, miraculous passion play that we call life. We realize that we have a bigger role to play in this cosmic drama, and that is terrifying, because to truly fulfill that cosmic role and function often means being prepared to step out of the neat lines and narratives of the status quo and to embrace whole parts of ourselves and whole parts of life that may make us look crazy and strange and weird and unusual to other people, because we have to then become the living symbol of a new idea, the living symbol of progress, which automatically means that we are stepping outside of the safe confines of the times in which we live and are a prophet for a zeitgeist and a world to come, which we can see in our visionary minds, but which is not yet here yet. And you have to have a faith and a belief in something which you can feel is possible, but which everyone else around you may feel is just so much hot air, or the diseased fantasies and imaginations of a overburdened nervous system. Anyway, I'm just going to keep that one brief. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Please like, share and subscribe. Please share your own experiences of this Uranus retrograde with me. I'd love to hear how it's affecting you. Not only is transiting Uranus trining Mercury retrograde, it's also trining my natal Mercury from my 3rd house, so my mind is definitely feeling very hard to control at the moment, as it's been seized by all kinds of intense electricities from the outer limits. Yes, if you'd like to get in contact with me, you can message me at thestarsunraveled@outlook.com. You can follow me on Instagram at astrologyandunderwear, and if you so choose, you can support me on Patreon at www.patreon.com/thestarsunraveled, so that I can have the funds necessary to carry on filling your minds with all kinds of strange Uranian nonsense from beyond the stars. Anyway, lots of love to you all.